Okay, here we go. This is NSCA Chapter 19, and we're talking about clients with nutritional or metabolic concerns. And specifically, the book will go into clients who are obese or overweight. Here are some takeaways from the book noted if you look on page 516 and 517 of your book, you'll see scope of practice is highlighted, appropriate exercise prescription, nutritional guidelines, for example, and then lifestyle strategies for the individual. Now, I can't stress this enough, and I've talked about this in class. I've worked in a medically based facility, and my scope of practice was very well defined in terms of I'm the personal trainer, I handle everything. And on the physical side, we had people who handled nutrition. We had other people who handled psychological interventions. So the scope of practice is very well defined in that environment. It's not so well defined when you're working one-on-one in a fitness facility, but I will tell you, you have to kind of know where your boundaries are and what's appropriate for you to talk about with your clients, even when we're talking about obese or overweight clients. Now, the book notes that obesity is considered a BMI over 30, and I would guess that some of these data points over here to the left might be a little bit dated. But I have to think they're going to be at or perhaps higher than they were noted here, 42.4% in 2018, and then childhood obesity tripling as of 2014, and we're now multiple whole decade beyond that. But the book does note down here that overweight and obesity have been designated as the second leading cause of preventable death in the United States. And you'll see that somewhere else further down the road, but also understand that it is a comorbidity for any number of other different conditions. So they differentiate here in terms of overweight and obesity. We already talked about obesity being a BMI greater than 30, whereas overweight is a BMI from 25 to 29.9. And the book makes this differentiation, and they talk a little bit in terms of specificity regarding these two populations. And they describe these differences in terms of, okay, you have an overweight person or an obese person. And, you look at this in terms of the overall work that a person must do to get up and function and work all day when they're a big body person. There is a lot of work that has to happen there just to be able to function and get up a flight of stairs. But they note, and they talk about this, they talk about positive energy balance, meaning more calories in than burned. They talk about neutral energy balance, where the consumption of calories equals the number of calories burned. And we talked about this in class the other day. If you have a person who weighs 138 pounds and they want to weigh 125 pounds, what caloric amount should they be eating? Should they be eating the amount to sustain the 138, or should they be eating a caloric amount to get to the 125? It becomes a conversation of how you're going to get there between a conversation of nutritional intervention as well as physical or movement intervention. But the book itself notes this very specifically. On average, a person who is obese has a higher resting metabolic rate and expends more energy in activities than those who are overweight or normal weight. The reason is that moving a heavy mass around requires more energy. So it makes sense. A person who is obese has a higher BMI than a person who is overweight. So therefore, they are moving theoretically, relatively speaking, more weight than the overweight person, if I can get it out. So the key that I want to get across is with the book and the quizzes and the questions, they're basically trying to get at the amount of calories burned depends upon the size of the body of the person. Now, granted, a person can have a 30 BMI and be 5 foot tall, or have a 30 BMI and be 6 foot tall. The 6 foot tall person who has a 30 BMI probably has more mass than the person who's 5 foot tall. Just realize that there's a mathematical component to BMI, and the individual who's carrying around more weight will, in fact, have a higher BMI and also will have a higher caloric burn just because they have to move around so much. And so the metabolic rate will be higher as well. All right. They make a note to differentiate here between gynoid and android obesity. And perhaps there's a mnemonic here where you can do something with Android obesity and Apple, like Android phones and Apple phones. Maybe they're both phones. It's a way to remember it. I don't know. It might help. But when they talk about gynoid obesity, that's the pear shape, where the fat is distributed mostly around the hips and the legs. Android or apple shape provides a predictor for type 2, and that's, if you think of like apple shape, is characterized by these high amounts of body fat in the trunk and abdominal areas. And when you look at that, the person's more like kind of barrely or kind of rounded. That predicts a higher risk for type 2 diabetes than if not. Now, we looked at, move this over here, abdominal fat. And when we look at abdominal fat, we're talking about basically a hip to waist ratio, right? We're talking about when we talk about measuring the circumference of one's waist. Now that becomes a conversation of determining what would be android obesity. And so when we have these cutoffs in place for type 2 diabetes, as well as dyslipidemia, hypertension, and cardiovascular disease, you have a BMI between 25 and 34.9, but you also have this measurement of over 40 inches in women over 35 inches. That correlates with more android obesity, which has a correlation or relationship with all the things listed here in this bullet point: type 2, dyslipidemia, hypertension, and cardiovascular disease. So you start to look at this when you're evaluating people. You can kind of look at your clients and determine which ones are shaped which way and have a better understanding of where they may have some contraindications, or perhaps they would have some comorbidities, is more accurate, as a result of their body type. Cardiovascular disease, they note here, is the leading cause of death across most racial and ethnic groups. It really doesn't pick any kind of specifics or favorites. And then beyond that, with factors that for cardiovascular disease include things that are modifiable, things that we can do in terms of workout and fitness and nutrition, and things that are non-modifiable, things that we inherit, and it's just how we're made. So some of the modifiable ones, are over here to the right when they talk about being overweight. I mean, people who perhaps have too high caloric intake, who have too sedentary of a lifestyle, perhaps they drink too much. These are different things where they are controllable. They're behavioral in a certain way. And so what they note here is in clients who are overweight or obese, these consistent lifestyle changes should help them reduce their body weight to a more ideal number, which, according to the American Heart Association, is a sustained loss of 3% to 5% of body weight, which is true to a point, right? When you're talking about a big body person who weighs 400 pounds or 500 pounds, you might see body weight loss in the neighborhood of 5 pounds, 8 pounds, 7 pounds, 6 pounds from week to week to week to week. And they'll go beyond the 3% or 5%. I mean, they'll end up losing almost like a whole nother person. You want to think of it that way. And to a certain degree, that's appropriate. Now, if you have somebody who is right at that 30 BMI, you'd have probably a little different curve, if you will, in terms of weight loss. It wouldn't be as steep. But there's still the ability to lose weight. But understand that what they're talking about is this here, and I'm sure you'll see this later on, is what they're talking about is the appropriate amount, according to the American Heart Association, is a sustained weight loss or sustained loss of 3 to 5% of one's body weight. All right, guys, I'm going to go ahead and stop here and move on to the next presentation.